great to be here. Who's enjoying the expo? Raise your hand. Enjoying it? Lots to learn. In the brief time we have together, in the next few minutes, I want to share as much as I can with you that can add some value to your life. Can I make the assumption, if you're sitting here, you are either, who's already an investor, and who wants to become an investor? Okay. So what I want to share with you, I guess, in this session, the topic is my top 10 investment strategies for 2014. Over the years, I've been an educator now for 15 years, educated over 500,000 people from over 17 different countries. So what I do at the beginning of each year, I release to my followers what I think is, in my opinion, the top 10 investments to be looking at, things that I'm predominantly doing, all come across people who've been doing very well from, that I think, the average person, the average Australian could take advantage of to improve their financial situation. So we're going to run through those today. By the way, this is just simply my opinion. It's not necessarily the order that you would do them in or whether you do them at all. But market conditions change. So every year, these tend to change at least slightly as market conditions change in Australia or globally, because you never know what's going to happen. Now, some people talk, let's look at the first one as an example. The first one that I have at the top of my list, and I've had this in the top 3 or 4 of my top investment strategies that I've used to become a millionaire many years ago, is Australian property. Who's already a property investor in the room? Most of us, or many of us at least, live in a property, I guess. Australian property has been very popular for a long period of time. I was taught by my first millionaire mentor 20 years ago. He said, Jamie, if you want to become a millionaire, if you want to do well financially, you simply need to buy Australian property and sit on it, buy and hold, and pretty much every 10 years it's likely to double in value. Make sense? He said that won't always work like clockwork. Sometimes they'll double in 6 or 7 years. Sometimes they'll take a little bit longer than 10 years. So that's what I started to do some time ago, and it's worked very well for me. There would be people in this room, in this expo, that could testify, yes, that's worked well for them. Let me ask you this question. Who here would have loved to have bought more property in Melbourne 10, 15, 20 years ago? Raise your hand. Okay, that's called hindsight. To become a millionaire, we need to have what? Foresight. Now, some people say, Jamie, it's all right for you. You were lucky. You got into real estate before the last property boom back in the late 90s, and you were just lucky. That's how come you did well out of property. But what about people starting out today? Well, I'd say to people, yes, I was lucky. It was true. I got in before a property boom. But back then, there was 19 million other Australians in the country that were just as lucky as myself. Does it make sense? So luck is not the key determinant of success. What is? Action. I didn't have the money at the time. I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but I had the guts to have the courage to get out there and get started, get creative, find a way to get a deposit on my first property, go and study and learn off successful people. See, at school and university, we're predominantly taught by people that have a PhD in theory, and no disrespect to professors, but a PhD in theory in the real world is not always worth that much. I decided to not just rely on school and university education. I decided to go and learn from people that have a PhD in results. Does that make sense? If I wanted to be successful in property and knew nothing about it, it would make common sense. The shortcut to success is go and find some property millionaires, learn off them, and then I can compress decades of knowledge. Like my first millionaire mentor was, took 30, 40 years to create his wealth. I could learn that and compress that down into a few short years. And that's how I was able to become in my 20s a self-made millionaire, not because I was any smarter than anyone else, but simply because I was learning off those who had a PhD in results. Does it make sense? And the cornerstone for that was real estate. And as Australians, we're very fortunate. We've had a great real estate market, and it's done very well for us. What will happen in the next 10 years? Does anyone have a crystal ball? Of course not. We would love to have one. Not even Warren Buffett has a crystal ball. So it's not a matter we want to look for the magic crystal ball. The reality is we can base it on fundamentals. So many people, even in the credit crisis, real estate did quite well, even in this country. I remember in 2008, there was a lot of economists coming out, and Professor Stephen Keen, if you've heard of him, they were coming out and saying Australian real estate's going to crash 40 to 60%. Even Harry Dent, leading economist from the US, who I invited out here to speak a few years ago, I said, Harry, I have agreed with everything you said in your books for years, but I do not agree with you on your predictions of the Australian real estate market because you're simply wrong. Okay, and why are these economists, why are these so-called experts wrong? Because they simply do not get property because they don't generally own enough of it. So I went on radio in 2008, said, I do not believe Australian property will crash 40 to 60%. I believe you'll actually see in some cities a growth of up to 20% before you see a correction. And those who are in Melbourne would have realised by 2010 we did see growth of up to 18% despite a credit crisis. Now the reason I could be so bullish and on those predictions is because I simply study the fundamentals of property, what drives property prices. I wrote to my followers 18 months ago and I said to my followers, I'm predicting a property boom in Australia for the next 3 years, and that's what we've seen in the last 18 months. Have we seen good growth, particularly in cities like Sydney in particular, and also Melbourne for the next 3 years? That would suggest I'm believing the next 18 months to 24 months we have still strong growth. Wherever interest rates are low, you'll start to see interest rates start to rise perhaps later this year and next year, and that will start to taper off the boom. We don't want a property bubble. The Reserve Bank worries about those things. As investors, we want continuous steady growth over a long period of time so we can all profit from that. If we see a bubble, we don't really want that. You might make money in the short term, but it can upset the property market. So unlike other markets like the UK and US that crashed after the credit crisis, Australia was pretty fortunate. You had a flat period, a little bit of going backwards in some suburbs, but then it's moved on and largely recovered. So I'm still confident if you were to buy property today, I've taught a formula to many followers, simply buy 2 investment properties, in 10 years time you'll be a millionaire. Does it make sense? If you work it out, 2 investment properties will double in the next 10 years. You'll pretty much be on the path to having a net worth of $1 million outside of your home. Some people say, what if it takes longer than 10 years to double? Well, let's say it took 15 years to double. Is a 15-year plan better than the pension plan, yes or no? Is a 15-year plan better than no plan whatsoever? That's the way I look at it. Number 2, I would put in the top 10. Number 2 is US property. This is certainly not for everyone, but for me, I also told my followers 3 to 4 years ago, guys, I'm going into the US property market. I believe it's close enough to the bottom, and I'm very bullish that the US property market will recover. In fact, I said, even if it doesn't recover, the rental returns of 15, 20, 30% rental returns are enough to pay back my $50 or $60 or $70,000 house that I can buy over there. So even if it never recovers for 10 years, I'm happy to buy US property because I can make the money back from the rental returns if it's done smartly. Not for everyone, you have to do it smartly, but I've been very aggressive in buying, I've bought hundreds of properties now, and I have the team, my team, I'm fortunate enough to have people go over there and buy them for me. And Lou spoke this morning on US property, and there's a booth over there if you want to learn from these guys that they're actively going out buying me property, and they do it for our members as well. They'll go and source you property. You've got to be in the right cities, got to do it right. But what we've seen in the US is that cities such as Phoenix that we first got into 3 or 4 years ago, we've seen some pretty rampant recovery in prices. We don't even touch those cities anymore because the prices have gone beyond getting the bargains. We've moved to other cities. So US property, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 type investment. I'm excited for it for a lot of people because some people can't afford $500,000 for an Australian property, but they want to get started in property. It is one way to consider, and that's why I've got it in certainly high up in the top 10. Great cash flow strategy as well. Number 3, subdivision. You just learnt about subdivision if you're listening to the previous speaker with Matthew. This is something I've added. This is new for 2014, wasn't in the top 10 in the past. I call it the immigrant strategy. And what I mean, did you know that if you migrate to Australia, you are 4 times more likely to become a self-made millionaire than if you're born here? Do you realize that? Raise your hand if that's good news for some of you, okay? The rest of you, unfortunately, blame your parents. It's their fault you were born here. But it's a fascinating statistic, and I won't go into why that is, but I can give you a clue. immigrants that move here tend to invest their money into real estate. They work really hard and they tend to put it into real estate, where the average Aussie doesn't so much. So real estate has created a lot of wealth for people. So I call this the immigrant strategy. It's pretty simple. Basically, you're buying a house with a bigger block in certain areas. You divide your back block and build a townhouse, and then you rent that townhouse out and you got extra income, or you sell the townhouse on the back block. Who knows if people have done this before? It's not that necessarily that sophisticated. I know people that aren't that sophisticated that made a couple of $100,000 doing this. They got the idea from someone. Of course, a little bit of education with someone that knows how to do it would help. And there's some guys here today, that can help you with that. Number 4, what are we looking at? Number 4 is land banking. Now, who's heard of land banking before? A lot of people. It's probably more of a sophisticated strategy. The BRW, and did some articles a few years ago on this. It's a strategy used by very wealthy Australians and very large property companies. So basically, what they do, cities like Melbourne, Bendigo, or any capital city and fast-growing regional city. Remember, a lot of the suburbs, outer suburbs of Melbourne, were once what? What were they years ago? Farmland. Does it make sense? They were once farmland. So let's say you bought a farm on the outskirts of a city that was $1 million. As that gets rezoned by a council and they rezone that farmland to residential zoning, a stroke of a pen by a council can turn $1 million worth of land into 10, 20, 30, $50 million. Does it make sense? Stroke of a pen. Who would like to get that pen that the councils have, by the way? That would be a very valuable pen. But that's literally how value is added, because many of you in this room have went and bought a house and land, or a block of land to build a house on, and you've paid hundreds of thousands of dollars just for a little piece of land that once was part of a farm that could have been bought for a tiny fraction of that. Does that make sense? You go, well, that's great, Jamie. Land banking, that's how rich people make their money. How do I do that? Now, the challenge in the past with land banking has been generally the banks will only loan you 60, 70%. And 2, there's no income. If you're going to say, Jamie, you expect me to go and buy land on the outskirts of Melbourne or other cities and sit on it for 10 or 20 years, paying interest with no income? You've got to be kidding. The average person, I'll get eaten alive. I can't afford to do that. And that's what's prohibited many people from getting into land banking. But like many strategies, if you are able to get educated or find people that can go out and find property developers that are willing to do things a little bit differently, we can take a strategy for the wealthy and make it more available to everyday people. So what we've been able to do, and it's something that I've been doing for many years now, I've been very bullish on it, is we go and negotiate with certain developers and say, guys, why don't you let us do something? So instead of buying the land, there's another, jot this down very quickly. The other option you have, excuse the pun, is you can option land. Just like you hear the traders here, you can take options in the stock market. You can do the same thing with land and property. Does that make sense? Property options. So what you can do, instead of having to go and put down a deposit, go to a bank, borrow to buy the land, and then sit there for 10 years for it to double in value, you can simply pay for an option fee. Jot this down. Control is far more important than ownership. A lot of people think you have to own everything. Control is more important than ownership. By controlling land that you don't have to pay for say 7 or 10 years, means you get the capital growth as the property prices go up before you have to pay for it. Who likes the idea of that, by the way? This is why I put it in the top 4, a phenomenal strategy if done correctly. Now, you can say, well, Jamie, that's great. So should I walk around, or should I go and talk to some of the big developers in Melbourne and say, I heard that Jamie McIntyre talking about land banking. I want you to give me an option over your land because I want to make the growth, the increase on prices over the next 10 years. And what are they going to say to you? They'll probably say, you're kidding, that's what we're doing, we're not going to let you. That's why they sit on the land 10, 20, 30 years. That's how they're making most of their money. They're not going to let you share in that pie. They're going to wait till they develop it and make you pay retail for it to put a house on it. Does that make sense? But there is some developers that are open-minded enough that can see and go, hang on, we say to them, look, you're going to be building this big development in 5, 7, 10 years. Why don't you basically take a haircut on a small percentage of that land where we can guarantee X amount of buyers, and where you won't make money necessarily on that small amount of land, but it means you have enough buyers, enough funding where you can make the money on the rest of the development. Does that make sense? So some developers are open-minded, creative, that will allow options to be taken over some of their land to do that. Not easy to do on your own, but it's a phenomenal strategy if you can get access to it. Basically, it works like this very quickly. Before I wrap up, I'm going to bring another speaker up for you quickly that will elaborate on this a little bit more. But let's say a block of land was $150,000 today. In 10 years, what's that likely to be worth? $300,000. The reality is land actually increases faster than houses. Houses depreciate, land appreciates. So land actually grows faster. So that probably would happen in 7 years. Let's say 7 to 10 years. The key would be if you could control this block of land today without having to buy it, but you pay an option fee to control it, and you don't have to pay for it for 7 to 10 years. In 7 to 10 years, you now have to pay for the land. Do you pay this price in 7 to 10 years, or do you pay this price? You only pay this price. Does it make sense? You're basically lay-buying land, effectively. You're saying, yeah, great, I'll lock in the contract now and pay for it in 7 or 10 years, as an example. But then that capital growth belongs to you, okay? You don't have to pay interest. You haven't had to go to the bank and borrow a cent. You just had to come up with an option fee to control the land. That's why I love it. That's why I do it. And that's why we've helped a lot of people in certain areas be able to take advantage of it. Who's following what I'm saying here? Who likes the idea of that? Something new for you? So that's land banking. That's why it's in the top 4 strategies. Let me go through the others very quickly. How much time do I have, team? I've got 5 minutes. I can talk for 5 days, you know. What are you doing? Give me 20 minutes. Like, what's going on here? Okay, so I'm going to bring another speaker up to elaborate a little bit more on land banking. I think it's a great strategy. Number 5, well, 5 is not really an investment strategy so much. Blogging, it's a way for people, my followers, to generate extra income. It's a trend. Blogging is a trend. You'll be familiar with it, but in the future, most people derive their income from blogging. In other words, if you love food, cooking, fashion, property, whatever your hobby is, learn how to start talking about it on a blog and build a following. Some of the blogs that started off now, Huffington Post was a blog, Drudge Report was a blog, Mamma Mia was a blog. All these were little blogs now taken off, and now they earn, some bloggers earn tens of thousands of dollars a year, some are hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, some literally millions of dollars a year by being bloggers. So you probably didn't expect to be taught about blogging here today, but that's something that we have followers that are doing quite well from. Number 6 is share. Lord is a share trading strategy. I'm not going to talk about that too much. There's plenty of booze around here today that would talk to you about that, but it works very well in conjunction with real estate. That's why it's a number 6. Number 7, internet domain trading. If you're into the internet, basically it's real estate online, buying real estate online effectively. Domain, website addresses, you can buy them and trade them. In other words, buy them cheaply, go up in value, resell them. It's a niche skill. It doesn't require a lot of capital, but some people like to do that and have done very well from it. Number 8, Bitcoin trading. Who's heard of Bitcoin? A few people heard of Bitcoin. Who would like to hear about Bitcoin? I don't have time to cover that today. We've had one of the guest speakers from the United States who spoke earlier today here at Bitcoin. We've had a Bitcoin conference, the first global Bitcoin conference in Australia, held here this weekend as well. I've been very bullish on Bitcoin. I'm one of the leading investors in Bitcoin in Australia and Bitcoin startup companies because I see massive potential. And it's not just investing in Bitcoin itself. I told my followers, I've made many predictions over the years to my followers. I told them to buy gold when it was $200 an ounce. It went to nearly $2,000 an ounce. I told people, as of course, to buy US property 3 or 4 years ago. I've told people to buy Australian property for many years. And I've also told people that when Bitcoin hit $120 to start buying Bitcoin, and within a space of 4 weeks, Bitcoin went to $1,200. We're past the price of gold. 10,000 invested into Bitcoin a little over a year ago was went to $1 million in value. It's been a phenomenal investment for those who got in the early stages. Now I'm shifting my focus to investing in Bitcoin companies. That's a different area of a kettle of fish for some people, but something to keep an eye on. Trust me this, my prediction is this: Bitcoin will change the world more than any other technology the world has seen to date. It will disrupt the banking system. The banks hate Bitcoin. They hate what we're doing, because why should you wait for 3 days for a check to clear? Why should banks make a fee on everything that you have to transfer? Why do we even need banks? Bitcoin is the new monetary system that can provide an alternative, healthy competition to banks. That's why I believe in it. It can change the world to make it a better place. 9 and 10, just quickly. Network marketing is not for everyone, but we have some people that do quite well from that with the internet these days, online. And number 10, Forex, which you'll heard some of the speakers this weekend with Forex. So there's my top 10 for 2014. I hope that's of some value for you.